So let me start by introducing Jimmy. Many of you know who he is. Jimmy is the Executive Director of Mission Waco and pastor of Church Under the Bridge. Dorrell is also a part-time professor at Baylor University. He's authored 2 books. Jimmy and his wife Janet, and I should say she could be a guest here in her own right.
Right.
She's outstanding. They've received numerous National Community Development Awards. Jimmy was recently named the 2016 Wacoan of the Year. Their goal is to be an employment-based ministry operating in a unique space between the church, city, nonprofits, and business. And I think that's what has always attracted me to what Mission Waco does. Is Jimmy is not just a nonprofit. He's working with really a numerous different partners in very creative ways. So please give a warm welcome to our guest, Jimmy Dorrell. All right, so Jimmy, give us a little bit of your family's history with Waco, how you felt called to this effort that I guess now spans several decades, and highlight some of the key goals and projects over the years for Mission Waco.
It is good to see you. Thank you. I've never been invited to the business school. This is really fun for me. Thank you for what you're doing, and I hope today's conversation is helpful as we cross over into the different disciplines. I came to Baylor in 1968. Tuition was $25 an hour. Can you believe that? Baylor won 4 football games in 4 years. So you get what you pay for. You pay more tuition, you get better games. And we have been here ever since, pretty much. We left a couple of times to go work in the global community. And I became a youth director as a sophomore here in Waco, and stayed through my Baylor years. And then after that, Waco was an awakening for me because two reasons. One was I grew up in the 60s, which was a very prejudicial time. King was marching. There was the issues of a lot of racial prejudice. I grew up in that culture where we were very divided. When I came to Waco, there was a lot of poverty, so it was poverty and racial issues that confronted me, and I had to begin to deal with some of my own inconsistent values. I had a phone call one day from an African-American pastor named Dewey Pinckney, who was head of the NAACP, and Pinckney called me from a church called St. Mary's Baptist Church. I didn't know you could have a St. Mary's Baptist Church. That was way out of my background. And Pinckney asked me to bring my youth group over to No Man's Land, which was this little pocket of poverty here in Waco, between Waco and the adjoining Belmead. And in that pocket of poverty, there was no infrastructure, there was no police, the houses were falling down. And I remember, in fact, as we walked around one day, there was a tree growing through a house, front porch, and we pushed the door open, and sure, nobody lived in there, and a man screamed, who was in fact living in that house. He didn't see us because he was living as a blind man in this neighborhood by himself with no infrastructure, no electricity, and the smell of poverty was overwhelming. And so at 19 years old, as a Baylor kid, in the richest nation in the world, just less than 2 miles from here, it was an overwhelming experience that will be with me forever, as I had to face the fact that just in the shadow of this university, there are still kids who will not eat tonight. And that reality was hard for me. I had to begin to work on some of my own stuff. And so as I got more involved in the community, I fell in love with Waco. I got invited after those years of youth directing to become the recreation supervisor in a children's home, then called the Waco State Home. Kids that had been taken away from their parents because of child abuse or neglect. And they were all put into this institution now called the Waco Center for Youth. And it was a world that I didn't even realize existed. I mean, these were kids who'd been very molested, abused every kind of way you can think of, and got cussed out by a 6-year-old the first day, and the whole thing went downhill from there. The hardest day of my life, hardest week of my life, and I had to sort of put up with my duplicity. I come from a Christian faith, and I was educated, discipled in that world, and now I knew the Bible verses, but how do you love a kid who cusses you out? How do you go to work every day when there's angry teenagers whose parents had abused them, and I was just another adult in their life, and so to trust me was a tough thing for them. So I had this kind of encounter with God. I went out to Cameron Park, had this little powwow with God, reminding how important I thought I was, and but I had to go back to work on Monday and had to face the fact that I had to learn to love kids whose outward attitudes, experiences were tough and hard to do. But to love somebody had nothing to do with their response to me. I had to learn to love them no matter how they acted. And that was a transforming 3 years for me. Nothing in my graduate school and all the rest was as powerful. Went on to seminary, worked inner city while we did that, and then went to Houston to work in a church there for 3 years. We began to try to understand the global context because poverty is global. So with a 1-year-old child on our back, we took off around the world, and my wife and I did a 4.5-month trip around the world working with the poor, and ended up in Calcutta. Got to meet Mother Teresa, got to hang out in the slums with her, the home for the dying, where they had 50 men and 50 women who were in their last days of life, and overwhelming experiences. Today, in our world, 21,000 children will die of hunger-related causes. Today, we live in a world that half the world makes less than $2 a day. I had to face the world that I never knew. I can read the statistics, but now I'm in it. And when you see a mother holding a baby that dies in the night because she can't feed it, couldn't nurse her own child, it changes you. And so with that experience in our life, we came back to Waco and decided that at least for temporarily, our call was to live among the poor. And so we bought an old house in what used to be the very nice part of Waco. Some of the stuff we'll talk about today is on North 15th and Colcourt area. That used to be the rich neighborhood back in the 20s and 30s of this city. And as the poor, who mostly were black, moved across the river into North Waco, white flight happened to the suburbs. And this old neighborhood that used to be the highlight of the city now had become prostitutes and crack dealers, a porno theater, 3 bars in the Jubilee Center where we work now. And it was rough. And we had 4 children and moved into the middle of a tough neighborhood and raised our kids there, and have been basically in that house for 40 years now. And we'll talk more about the model that we worked from, but that's been who we are. So we love Waco. We love the community, both rich and poor, black, white, brown. We feel very integrated into this culture. And one of our joys has been to be involved with Baylor. I teach a couple classes at Truett Seminary and 1 or 2 in Baylor at different times. And so we get the academic side, but more importantly, we get the real side of life. And to see you guys come across town to work with us in our children's clubs, our teen clubs, all the things we do. We have hundreds of Baylor students that connect with us. To watch you come out, some of you come from a very strong faith-based background, but your worldview was pretty small. Now you're in the middle of our city trying to understand it yourself. At the same time, you're trying to understand what that means for your future as well. So we've been here a long time, living in the midst of that and doing the ministry style that we do, which I'll tell you more about in a minute.
Okay. So, I mean, Mission Waco, I think, has received a lot of national attention, which is fun. You were before Magnolia and Fixer Upper.
Yeah.
People have come here from a lot of larger cities to try to learn from what you guys do. I mean, can you identify at least a couple of unique or innovative things that have people are trying to solve this problem everywhere that make what you guys do unique or special?
To answer that for me means to explain that we have certain principles we work from. We're not just another urban ministry. About 5 years after we had moved into this low-income neighborhood, challenging, tough stuff going on, people thought we'd lost our mind to raise our kids in that tough neighborhood. We found out about a group called Christian Community Development Association, CCDA. They were having a conference each year. It just so happened the next conference was in Denver. And so we went there, and it was like we found our best friends. People who thought like we did, understood us. They'd been around 4 or 5 years as a conference. And we became friends, got on the board of directors with them in the national boards. And it was really the most meaningful part of this ability to move on with what we were doing. So we met, to me, the heroes of my faith who were working in Los Angeles or New York or wherever it was, doing the same kinds of things we were doing. So we learned from them, they learned from us. It became a very strong network in our lives. In the middle of that, we came back with a theology of urban ministry, which is a little bit unique. We know that a lot of people go down and help a bunch of poor kids learn how to read better, etc. But we felt like the basic principle of CCDA and what we believe is the people with the problem must be a part of the solution to the problem. And so let me explain that. Most of you in this room are compassionate people. You care for people that are poor. You care for people that have problems. But unfortunately, sometimes the very things we do cause more harm than good. Many of you read the book When Helping Hurts as a model. Way before that book was out, that was what we believed, that we had to engage people with struggles to solve the answers. And so the model of just going in and painting somebody's house or fixing up something for somebody because they needed it was not going to change poverty in Waco. We had to work from an empowerment model, and so that meant not only to engage the people as leaders with us, it also meant that we had to listen to them. And some of the projects that we thought were so important were not as important to them. For example, if their house needed painting, that looks like it's a great fixer-upper kind of day for stepping out, but in reality, they may care more that their kid has a place to play safely around the drug dealers. And so we listened and learned to listen. It was not a skill I think we all had very, very well, but with those principles of community development, we think bottom up. So instead of us deciding what they need, let's go help those poor people, it was just the opposite. It was listening to them and asking them what they thought was needed. So the most powerful project that we have done for me in all these 25 years of ministry, 40 years of living in the neighborhood, was the grocery store that we finished this last year called the Jubilee Food Market. In my neighborhood, the closest grocery store is 2.2 miles away. We live in a food desert. It's all over America. Small-time grocery stores no longer exist. In Dallas, I had a group of people from Dallas come down last week. They're coming back next week because in South Oak Cliff, there is no grocery store. And the city council in Dallas has said we'll give $3 million to any group that will go build a grocery store in South Oak Cliff. Well, they came here because we had decided the same thing. We didn't have that kind of money, but we, through a long process of lots of years, had our neighborhood people say over and over, we either have two choices. We can go walk 2.5 miles one way to get healthy food and affordable food, or we can go across the street over here to the convenience store and pay $3 for an 85-cent loaf of bread and eat food that we shouldn't eat and get fat, not have good nutrition, or we can, and it takes away our money. So those choices are not good choices. And so because we heard them say that year after year, we eventually were able to purchase the old convenience store. By the way, that store had been a Safeway back in 1925. Then it had been a convenience store for all these years. And I remember one day I was over in the parking lot there, and two women came by that were grandmamas holding their grandchildren's hands, and they'd just gotten back from walking 2.5 miles one way, sweat pouring off 100 degrees outside, and they said to me, "Sir, I don't know who you are, but would you please help us get a grocery store?" So the first thing we did after we finally bought the store, is a long, interesting story how we got it, but we bought the store after all these years, and the water was everywhere, it was a mess, and so we basically brought 65 neighborhood people together. Remember, the people with the problem need to be a part of the solution, and so we to be honest with our own principles, we invited the whole neighborhood. 65 people showed up, and we asked them, what do you think this store should be? And 77% said we want a grocery store. Well, we began to do the research, the things that you guys do in classroom, to find out how do you make a grocery store work. And here's what we found out. It is a very low profit margin. Food is only a few cents per item that you make profit on. Today, grocery stores like Walmart and H-E-B do not make their money on the groceries. They make it on the hair stuff and the pharmaceuticals and the eyeglasses and TVs, everything else but groceries. But we couldn't do that. That was not what our purpose was. So it was a small 6,500 square foot store, and we listened and then began to think, how in the world are we going to pull this off? Began to do the research. I was speaking one night in Dallas at a big church there, and finished up, and these two guys came up and said, I think we need to help you. Well, this is your world. These are your folks that know the business world. These two guys came up and said, one guy said, I ran Kroger's all over the Northeast. The other guy says, I still build Kroger's all over Dallas, and we are willing to come down to Dallas on some weekends to help you. So those two men, very Christian-based men, came back down, and we met in the World Cup Cafe every other week for the next 6 months. 10 men eventually sat around. We didn't have but one woman, and she was the supplier of the grass-fed beef that we sell. But we learned how to do a grocery store, and these men were very good at it, so we began to raise money to actually do the construction of the grocery store. We sold shares. We created this little manipulative kind of thing that said, okay, if you'll give us $25, we'll sell you a share of stock. It's worthless on Wall Street. Means a lot in our neighborhood, so we sold these shares of stock, and people began to buy them. We had to raise, initially, we thought it was going to be $450,000. I have to raise a lot of money for Mission Waco. We're a large ministry, and I was afraid that if they give to the grocery store, they may not give to us anymore, so it was a risk. But people began to give that had never given before, because I guess somehow something clicked in their minds that it's just not right for people to have to walk 2.5 miles to a grocery store. That's just wrong. And very predatory, lottery tickets, 40 ounces, all that stuff. So we kept going and eventually raised $650,000 cash, and then the contractors that had helped us donated at discounts as much as $250,000 more. So the project ended up being $900,000, and on November 21st of this past year, we opened up the Jubilee Food Market. And we celebrated, the parking lot was packed with all the neighbors and the community, and since then we've people have been coming every day, and it's been that kind of, so that's probably the one that stands out the most. There's a lot of other projects, but since that was so long, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see.
Yeah, you
show
want to put the pictures up? So we have this is the only slide.
The store on the top right, Jubilee Food Market, and then this is the inside down below of, and by the way, one of our principles is we believe in the dignity of the poor, and so you don't do thrift store looking stuff. You do it right, and you spend the money to make sure it's pretty, and the store has dignity written all over it, and people love it, and it's been extremely well received by the community.
So I want to just kind of return to, the fundamental part of people's brokenness, and I'm assuming John Perkins is one of your heroes from the community development group, and he and Corbett and Fiekert's book on When Helping Hurts, they all mentioned these different forms of brokenness. And when I started teaching, I always think about financial brokenness. You can see financial poverty, but you have the social, spiritual brokenness from mentally. How much do those other factors play a role in trying to restore people financially, getting them employed? And do they recognize it? I mean, do they know I have problems in these areas, or is that something that you have to try to help them figure out for themselves? I'm
not sure they cognitively could name them, but they know it. We work with thousands of people. We have a homeless shelter with 56 beds. We work with the mentally ill. We work with folks who are addicted, ex-offenders. All the broken people of our world are involved somehow with us. The common denominator is people are people. And that sounds so simple, but it's such a powerful thing. So students like you oftentimes don't understand what was just communicated, that poverty is so much more than money. But when the guy is standing on the street corner in your city or here in Waco asking you for money, and you give him money, that doesn't really help. I'm not telling you give or not give. I won't get into that, or I'll answer that as a later question. But the reality is, I don't care how much money you give him, that is not going to change his poverty. The reality is dignity starts first. Remember, the people with the problem need to be a part of the solution. Until that person, family, unemployed, whoever it is, has respect for themselves, they're not going to try again. They've been beaten up by life. They've given up. Many of them have just quit trying. So relationships are the number one way to do that. And so what you're going to find consistently in all these principles is that if you really want to help, build relationships with people, and don't start off with giving money. But that takes time. It's not just like a quick encounter. You don't go out on the street and just make that happen. It takes weeks, months, years. And so because I've been around a long time, I know the people. There are homeless people that I will let babysit our grandkids. There are people I wouldn't give them a nickel or trust them because I know they're on crack or whatever the issues are. There's this wide variety of why people are poor. Don't ever stereotype and think poor people are like this. They're just as different as you and I. And so once you know that, and once you get the courage to build some relationships with them, it not only changes them, it changes you. And that partnership has to have boundaries. You've got to learn how to what to do and what not to do. It's going to get messy sometimes. But once they know that you care about them as a person and they're not a project, then you can help them broker the deal. I got a job as a 14-year-old kid because my Little League coach, Mr. Quinn, gave me a job mopping the floors at Quinn's drugstore. I learned how to work. I have a work ethic. I've had it all my life because of Mr. Quinn. But if you're 19 years old living in the housing complex, there's a good chance you don't have a Mr. Quinn in your life. Maybe not a dad in your life. It's nobody helping you. How do you learn those basic pre-employment work maturity skills? And then how do you find the job? So Mission Waco moves into the role of filling those holes that a lot of the folks that we work with simply don't have. But they're all the same reason, all by relationships. So it is empowering, and then you got to teach people how to do budgets, how to do, sometimes you're not any better. Just because you have money doesn't mean you know how to spend it. Learning the skill sets that all of us need are important for all of us. And sometimes things are so simple that you wouldn't think it was important, but those are the very things that are the problems because they don't have them. So yes, relationships is the answer.
And I always start off my social entrepreneurship class with this issue of poverty as these different forms of brokenness. And I think it became very clear to me as I understood that we have a lot of brokenness, even among people who are not financially wealthy. There's a lot of mental issues, a lot of family problems, a lot of other problems. And I think as we approach people who are poor, it's just recognizing, okay, these people are not financially well off, but I may be more broken in some areas than they are. And so I think that just in a kind of a humility, it reminds us, like you said, we're all people. We all have different struggles. Ours may not be financial, but recognizing that.
Can I just say how important what you said is? Because I'm around poor people who are much healthier than we are sometimes. They have a positive view of life. They care. We have this idea that because they're poor, they're missing all these pieces. But I'm going to tell you, I was humbled over and over when I moved in the neighborhood with my kids and found out some of those folks who we think, well, maybe they're not even Christian. They knew more Bible than I knew. I mean, sometimes they had a better worldview than I did. So just be careful. When you go to the homeless shelter, if you ever go to My Brother's Keeper, do a devotion, we do have groups like you go every night. More often than not, the groups who go to do that 45-minute devotional come out more humbled than the poor people that they go help because they realize they had such a misunderstanding of the poor, and these are probably the ones that are struggling the most. But you're exactly right. It is all about respecting people as individuals and families, not as socioeconomic groups.
Yeah. So I want to get into kind of the core of why I think it's so interesting to have you here, because I do believe, as you mentioned, there's a broad desire for our business students, for those of you who are business, to use their skills in some way to help the poor. And I think there seems to be an interesting distinction that's not maybe necessarily public-private, though that's a key one when we think of, businesses, for-profit businesses are all about profits, nonprofits are about helping people. But there seems to be some kind of other distinction. I don't know if it's incentives. I'm trying to figure out, when business people think about helping somebody, they think in a market-based way. What does the consumer need? So in some ways, some of the things you described, asking people what they want from a business perspective, that seems to be important. Why do you think there's such a distinction in terms of how people think, well, business is about profits, it's not really about helping people, nonprofits are...
No, that's a great... First of all, I think there is this categorical mistake that most of us make by dividing up the world. The Christian background comes out of a holistic worldview where everything is connected. You and I come out of a Greek academic world mindset where things get compartmentalized. Well, you're in the business school, you're in the religion department, or this is spiritual, this is physical, this is mental. Those are Greek categories that historically were not the only way to look at the world. So when you break those down and realize it's not about these, your spiritual life is not separate from your mental or your, it's all connected, okay? And when you think about the business world and get out of this category of this is over here and you're out to make a profit, then you miss it. So let me give you a great example. Down the bottom left slide is the World Cup Cafe. I don't know if you've been there or not. We're the #1 cafe in the city last year. We are the #1 breakfast in town still. It's packed out on Saturday morning. Little bitty cafe. That cafe was the corner building of the Jubilee Center. When we moved in the neighborhood that was so rough, that particular shopping center which had a theater that used to be called the Texas Theater, where the old folks went to see their first movie when they were 85. They're 85 now. When they were kids. It's got our offices and then some visual art stuff. But in the corner, there's an old beauty shop. This particular shopping center was sitting 3 inches in water, boarded up by the city of Waco, and it was the roughest corner in town. Prostitutes worked the streets right there, crack dealers on the corner, and it was a mess. And so we moved in 1978. About 1994, we went down to that whole shopping center. And again, this is not my background. We went down and found the owner and said, will you make us a deal on this 5 buildings of this shopping center sitting in water? And he said, no, here. And he signed the deed and handed it to me and said, it's yours. Now, for him, it wasn't like he was compassionate. He doesn't have a tax write-off. It was eating him alive in property taxes. And we had this gut feeling like, oh my word, what do we just do? Is it faith or is it stupid? You know, which one of these is it? And so through the next few weeks, months, years, we began to fix that building up in this really tough neighborhood. And the shopping center today is kind of the icon of change. The theater now is called the Jubilee Theater. We do incredible plays there. Children do theater, all kinds of things. But the corner where we wanted to put remember, everybody in Waco had left. If you were middle class, and when the poor moved in and white flight happened to the suburbs, you wouldn't come back down to this neighborhood because it was that rough. So we had a dilemma. How do we, until you have a healthy neighborhood, which means economics too. You got to understand this. It's not about just doing programs. We have lots of programs. But until there is an economic development piece tied to Mission Waco, we can never bring back that corner because there's no money that stays in the neighborhood. And so we finally said we've got to create some kind of cafe or something that generates, well, you know, or if you don't know, you should learn before you leave here, about 70% of cafes fail anyway, and about 110% of them fail in poor neighborhoods. And so we knew we first of all tried to franchise it out. So anybody will give you free space if you will put a cafe or something that brings people back to this corner. Nobody took it. For 2 years we waited. Nobody showed up. Then we said, okay, we know we're going to lose money. We're not dumb. You don't have to have a business degree to know that you're going to lose money on this deal. But our goal was not money. Our goal was bringing people back to the neighborhood. And so our board of directors had to look at it. We were spending money on children's programs and homeless, all these things that were very important. And the question was, how much money could we lose? Not how much could we make, how much could we lose? And so the board, after looking at it, we studied it together. We made a decision about that amount, and then we began to redo the old corner and created the World Cup Cafe. This will be our 11th year. We'll break even this year. I am not the entrepreneur that should be teaching the class on entrepreneurship, unless your goal is different, because the place is packed. Middle class Waco is there. Poor people are there. It is black, white. It is everything we wanted to happen happened in the cafe, but it's not happening because we're making money. So our goal was simply to break even. The grocery store is the same thing. It'll probably take us 2 years to really break even. So we go into these things with reality checks, but we're making money now, and we're paying for most of the staff there. So it's just a matter of principle. Our goals are just different, but they're all business. It's business. We got to run a good business. We got to understand POS systems and ethics and all the stuff that you guys learn here. We just do it from a nonprofit status.
Why has it been so important to the redevelopment of that part of town that they see a grocery store, or they see a cafe, or they see a business per se? And why, normally I would think markets, if there's a need, the market, it should fill that need, but it doesn't often in these neighborhoods. Why has that been so important, and what has been the effect?
Well, back to the dignity thing, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me in the grocery store and just hugged me and said, thank you for putting a grocery store here, because it values them. It shows that they matter just as much as people that have a nice car to drive to the big grocery store. And once people feel they're valued, then the neighborhood changes. And so today we really have, we're trying to always be careful about gentrification. That's a separate issue we won't get into. But probably about 1/4 of our neighborhood now are more of the hipsters, the middle class that don't want to live in a ethnocentric neighborhood that looks like me. They want to have blacks and whites and browns and rich and poor. And so we have a fair number of people who are now, because there's grocery stores and cafes and there's healthiness around, are comfortable in what used to be a very blighted, poor neighborhood. So it's the rebuilding. Quite honestly, we will not be a completely healthy neighborhood until there are people moving in that are not driven by Mission Waco. In other words, we've got to be the catalyst. We're willing to take the risk to do the cafes and the stores, but someday, Lord willing, in the future, there's going to be some business that says, you know what, it's so much better over there now, we're going to put our business over there, or there's enough population that we can sell whatever it is. And we've got a hip-hop shop or two, and there's a few things around now, but not anything substantial. That building up on the left is a liquor store across the street from the cafe, Martha Jane's, and we're doing a campaign right now to raise funds for the next 25 years. It's kind of our dream, and one of those is to make that into an economic center. So that would be folks like you who say, we're going to come over. We don't need to go to the west side of town. We'll put a store right over there, across from there, because in a few years, it's going to be healthy. So the tension will be, as market forces come in, not to make property taxes sky high and gentrify so that the rich move in, the poor get displaced. And I'll be honest, with Magnolia and some of the things happening, it is a fear. I mean, there really is this tension. Harp Design is just down the street where they make all the stuff for Magnolia. So there is now we're not like most big cities like Atlanta and Houston, where if you live out in the suburbs, it takes an hour to get downtown. You live in Woodway and be downtown in a few minutes. But it's cool to live with new urbanism, live in a loft apartment, things that you guys are impacted by. But you don't have to in Waco like you have to in Houston. It's just a different set of skills. But we have to be very sensitive to the market forces, so we're working for the best of our people and not being part of the problem.
So for most students here, I would assume, are studying business or some way related to the school here. What are some ways you can see that they could help using some of the vocational skills, some of the things they're being trained in, both while they're here at Baylor, maybe working with you, or when they get out of school? Where have you seen people's business skills really be of use?
I think the dream for me is that, I mean, and there's been several of you that have done projects or papers on, you know, studying what kind of low-income neighborhoods have done to create business. But quite honestly, it's been more of a find out and Google stuff and not really get in the practice of it. I believe this marriage between Baylor and Mission Waco is such a rich possibility, because we're going the same direction in so many ways, and we need your skill sets. We need not just, I bet I've had 5 different students this week ask me, can I meet with them to do their one paper on leadership and homelessness, and I don't have that time left. And I don't mind doing that, but what I really need is you to do your master's thesis around that question, or the PhD to help us with the research and the analysis of what can we do. You understand that better than I do. What can you do to help us understand market forces and create things to happen in the neighborhood that I will never know those kind of things like you do. So with the marriage of these two things, where you're getting humbled by relationships, I mean, for some guy it may be, how do you create a lawnmower shop that works? How do you do a budget? We got a lot of people who have dreams in our neighborhood, but they don't have business thinking. They didn't pay their sales tax or payroll tax. You know, they don't know the things you know that are very basic skills. But on the other hand, you need them, because they're ready to get help. And so I think alliances of sorts that will happen between, it's harder, it's always going to be harder in the inner city than it is in the suburbs. But some of you, you say, give me the challenge. I want to have that. But I hope within 5 years we're going to have some pop-up businesses. I mean, already I'll have 200 people in the streets this week in our neighborhood having a race. We have a 5K race. Neighborhood people, Baylor kids, others. We have music. We'll have a Jubilee Music Festival. There's fun stuff happening in our neighborhood. But the business side is still pretty far behind, and we've got to work with you to find out how to do that better.
Okay, so just before we get to some Q&A from the audience, just kind of summarize, if you can, a few of the key, you've mentioned several of them. Are there any other kind of key activities that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, we have 15 programs. I have 70 staff today, so we're a large group. We start with children, but we don't just do after-school little stuff. We're teaching engineering classes to kids that are from the neighborhood. Our children are mostly behind grade level reading and math. We use Baylor kids a lot for that help. We do. We have the arts. We have dance and drama and music instruments now. We have the arts are no longer in schools, so we get those kids when they're young. Teach them chess. We teach them how to play chess. And you know why is that so important? It's strategic thinking, but nobody's ever played chess with them, so we have a chess club. So you can start at that level. It's a great place for freshmen and sophomores at least, if not some of the others who've never worked with poor people, to get in and get a little more comfort level. But from there, it's teenagers, urban teenagers. I don't care if you're rich or poor, you're hard to work with because you're a teenager. We call them pre-humans. And our middle school kids are some of the funnest. Last year, we sent 14 kids to Washington, D.C. after raising enough candy money. We sold candy all year long so they could get on a first plane they've ever been on. So we do lots of things so you can come and help them see the bigger world. And then we do, once you move into the adult world, it varies so much based on the problems. If it's unemployment, if it's reintegration, if you're coming off the street, coming out of prison, into how to get a job. And so I would just say these programs vary a lot, but based on your interests, our alcohol and drug rehab was the #1 faith-based program in the state of Texas last year. Some of the best guys, I love that program. And so if you have come out of a recovery kind of background, how to help them, and then how they can help you as well, because it's a really, really good. So there's lots of that. You just simply come in and say, here's what I'm interested in, here's the timeline I've got. We have internships, work study students, all those. It's a place you can connect to.